I'll never forget the look on Natasha's face when I stood up at their engagement party and announced exactly who had been paying for her lavish lifestyle for the past 2 years. Pure, unadulterated shock washed over her like a tidal wave, hitting an unsuspecting shore. Her perfectly manicured hand, the one that had been gesturing dismissively at me just moments before, while she called me a burden in front of 50 guests, froze mid-air as if time itself had stopped. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her sapphire blue eyes, the same ones that had rolled dramatically when my brother Caleb introduced me as his unemployed sister who's been crashing with us, widened to the size of dinner plates. The confident smirk she'd been wearing, while regaling the crowd with stories about how I was draining their resources and preventing them from truly starting their life together, crumbled into something that resembled a deer caught in headlights during a midnight collision. The champagne flute slipped from her trembling fingers, crystal shattering against the marble floor of the Grandview Country Club's main ballroom with a sound that seemed to echo through the sudden, deafening silence. 50 of Millbrook's most elite residents, people who had been laughing at her carefully crafted jokes about my supposed freeloading just seconds before, now stared in stunned bewilderment as the woman they'd been celebrating transformed before their very eyes. But here's the thing that made this moment absolutely perfect, the detail that still brings a smile to my face when I replay it in my mind. Natasha didn't just stumble backward in shock. She didn't just gasp or cover her mouth in embarrassment. No, Natasha Pemberton, the woman who had spent the entire evening painting herself as the long-suffering victim of her future sister-in-law's supposed dependency, actually collapsed. Not a graceful swoon like in those period dramas she was always watching, not a calculated feint designed to regain sympathy and redirect attention. This was a full, genuine legs giving out from under her collapse that sent her designer gown billowing around her as she hit the polished floor with an undignified thud that somehow managed to be heard over the collective gasp of the entire room. The irony was so thick you could have cut it with the platinum cake knife they'd received as an engagement gift from Caleb's law firm partners. Here was a woman who had built her entire social persona around being the sophisticated, financially savvy marketing executive who was rescuing my brother from his family's supposed financial burdens, lying in a heap on the floor because she'd just learned that everything she thought she knew about money, power, and control in this relationship was not just wrong but spectacularly backwards. You see, what Natasha didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly imagined as she stood there in her $3,000 emerald green silk gown that perfectly complemented her engagement ring, was that I hadn't been unemployed for the past 2 years. I hadn't been living off their generosity, sleeping on their couch and eating their food out of desperation or inability to support myself. What she didn't know was that while she'd been accepting what she believed were Caleb's generous gifts, his ability to afford their downtown penthouse apartment, their weekend trips to Napa Valley, and yes, even that stunning 3-carat diamond currently glinting on her finger as she lay sprawled on the floor, she'd actually been living a life funded entirely by someone she'd just publicly humiliated. The woman she'd called a burden, the sister she'd accused of preventing their financial independence, the person she'd suggested should, quote, find her own place and stop taking advantage of family kindness, was the same person whose money had been paying for absolutely everything in their seemingly perfect life together. Every designer handbag she'd carried into charity luncheons while complaining about supporting me. Every spa weekend she'd enjoyed while suggesting I needed to get my act together. Every expensive dinner where she'd made pointed comments about people who don't contribute equally to relationships. All of it had been funded by the very person she was now staring up at from the floor with a mixture of horror and dawning comprehension. The guests began murmuring among themselves, confusion rippling through the crowd like stones thrown into still water. Mrs. Blackwell from the Historical Society leaned toward her husband, whispering urgently. The partners from Morrison and Associates exchanged meaningful glances. Even the catering staff had stopped what they were doing to witness what was clearly becoming the most dramatic engagement party in Millbrook's recent memory. And there was my brother Caleb, standing frozen beside the 3-tiered cake that I had secretly paid for, his face cycling through emotions faster than a slot machine. Confusion, realization, panic, and finally, something that looked remarkably like a man watching his entire world reorganize itself in real time. But I wasn't done. Oh no, not by a long shot. Standing there in my simple black dress that Natasha had earlier commented was so basic, but I suppose it's all some people can afford. I looked down at the woman who had spent 2 years systematically trying to erase me from my brother's life, and I smiled. It was the kind of smile that comes from finally having the moment you've been waiting for. The moment when truth cuts through deception like sunlight through storm clouds. The moment when someone who has underestimated you, dismissed you, and attempted to diminish you realizes they've been playing a game where they never understood the rules. Because what happened next would change everything. Not just for Natasha, not just for Caleb, but for our entire family and everyone in that room who thought they knew exactly who held the power in this relationship. The real story was just beginning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Before we dive deeper into what led to that spectacular moment at the Grandview Country Club, I need to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from right now. Are you Team Justice like me, or do you think I went too far? And here's what I really want to know. Have you ever been in a situation where someone completely underestimated you? Maybe a family member, a coworker, or even a so-called friend who thought they had you all figured out, only to discover they were dead wrong about who you really are and what you're capable of. Because let me tell you something. The story you're about to hear isn't just about money or family drama. It's about what happens when people make assumptions based on appearances, when they mistake kindness for weakness, and when they forget that sometimes the quietest person in the room is actually the one holding all the cards. If you've ever felt invisible, overlooked, or dismissed by people who should have known better, this story is going to resonate with you in ways you might not expect. And if you've ever had that moment, you know the one I'm talking about, where you finally got to show someone exactly who they were dealing with, then you're gonna love every single twist and turn of what's coming next. But here's the thing, and this is important. What happened at that engagement party wasn't the end of the story. It wasn't even close to the end. In fact, it was just the beginning of a chain of events that would expose secrets I never saw coming, reveal truths about my own family that shocked me to my core, and ultimately lead to consequences that none of us could have predicted. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because tomorrow I'm sharing part 3 of this saga, and trust me when I say you're not going to want to miss it. We're talking about family betrayals, financial manipulation, and a revelation about my brother that made Natasha's public humiliation look like a gentle wake-up call. The comments on my last video were absolutely incredible. Over 12,000 of you shared your own stories about family drama and standing up for yourselves, and reading every single one reminded me why I love this community so much. You understand that sometimes the most important battles we fight aren't with strangers or enemies, but with the people who are supposed to love and support us unconditionally. And speaking of community, I want you to know that your stories matter to me. Whether you're dealing with toxic family members, manipulative partners, or anyone who's trying to make you feel small, remember this. You have more power than you think you do. Sometimes it just takes the right moment, the right words, and the right amount of courage to remind people that they shouldn't have underestimated you.
So grab your favorite drink, get comfortable, and let me take you back to where this all began. Because understanding how I ended up standing over Natasha Pemberton's collapsed form in front of 50 of Millbrook's elite requires understanding exactly who I am, what I've been through, and why I was willing to risk everything to make sure the truth finally came out. This isn't just my story. It's a story about justice, about family loyalty, and about what happens when someone pushes the wrong person too far for too long. It's about the moment when being the bigger person stops being an option, and sometimes you have to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity. Are you ready for this journey? Because once we start, there's no going back. The truth has a way of changing everything, and after tonight, you'll never look at family dynamics, financial power, or engagement parties the same way again. Let's do this together. Let me introduce myself properly, because understanding who I am is crucial to understanding how everything that followed became possible. My name is Jasmine Moreau, and at 28 years old, I'm what most people would politely call a self-made entrepreneur, though the journey to get here wasn't exactly conventional. 3 years ago, I was working as a junior financial analyst at a mid-tier investment firm in downtown Millbrook, pulling in a modest salary that barely covered my studio apartment rent and student loan payments. I was the classic overworked, underpaid recent graduate who spent her weekends creating complex financial models for clients who made more in a month than I made in a year. But I had something that most of my colleagues didn't: an obsession with cryptocurrency and blockchain technology that bordered on the unhealthy. While everyone else was going out for drinks after work, I was home studying market patterns, learning about decentralized finance, and slowly, methodically investing every spare dollar I could scrape together into what most people still considered a risky gamble. My coworkers thought I was crazy. My family thought I was wasting my money on internet coins. Even my brother Caleb, who's 4 years older and has always positioned himself as the financial expert in our family thanks to his law degree and corporate job, used to lecture me about throwing good money after bad. But here's what nobody understood about me, what they still don't understand. I've always been able to see patterns where other people see chaos. Numbers speak to me in a way that feels almost intuitive. When I was studying those cryptocurrency markets at 2 a.m., drinking my third cup of coffee, and surrounded by charts that looked like abstract art to most people, I wasn't gambling. I was calculating. I was predicting. And more often than not, I was right. The breakthrough came 18 months ago with a relatively unknown altcoin called Quantum Ledger. While everyone was focused on Bitcoin and Ethereum, I'd identified what I believed was a severely undervalued project with revolutionary potential in the supply chain management sector. I liquidated my entire savings account, took out a personal loan that terrified me, and invested everything into Quantum Ledger at 23 cents per coin. 6 months later, when a major corporation announced they were adopting Quantum Ledger's technology for their global logistics network, the price shot to $47 per coin overnight. Just like that, my $15,000 investment became worth over $3 million. But here's where most people would have made their first mistake. They would have told everyone. They would have celebrated publicly, bought flashy things, moved into a mansion, and made sure the whole world knew about their success. I did the opposite. I kept my mouth shut, maintained my modest lifestyle, and most importantly, I kept working at my regular job as if nothing had changed. The only person I told was Caleb, because despite everything that would happen later, he's still my brother and I trusted him completely. I needed someone to help me navigate the legal and tax implications of my windfall. And as a corporate attorney specializing in financial regulations, he was the obvious choice. He helped me set up the necessary legal structures, establish proper tax strategies, and create what he called management protocols that would protect my assets while allowing for strategic reinvestment. What I didn't tell Caleb, what I didn't tell anyone, was that Quantum Ledger was just the beginning. Over the next year, I parlayed that initial success into a series of increasingly sophisticated investments across multiple cryptocurrency projects, traditional markets, and emerging technologies. My portfolio grew from $3 million to $8 million, then to $15 million, and eventually to a number that would probably shock you even today. I became what the financial world calls a crypto whale, an investor whose holdings are large enough to influence market movements. But I was an invisible whale, operating through carefully constructed trusts and investment vehicles that my brother had helped me establish. To everyone in my life, including my family, I was still just Jasmine, the financial analyst, who lived in a modest apartment and drove a 5-year-old Honda Civic. This brings me to my relationship with Caleb, because understanding our dynamic is essential to understanding why what happened at that engagement party was so devastating for both of us. Caleb has always been the golden child in our family. Valedictorian in high school, full scholarship to Westfield University, law review at Columbia Law School, and a prestigious position at Morrison & Associates, one of Millbrook's most respected law firms. Growing up, I was always Caleb's little sister, the quiet one who was good with numbers but didn't have his charisma or social confidence. Our parents, who run a small but successful accounting practice, always spoke about Caleb's achievements with a pride that was almost blinding. When people asked about their children, they would light up talking about their son, the lawyer, and then mention almost as an afterthought that they also had a daughter who worked in finance. I never resented this dynamic, honestly. Caleb earned his success through hard work and intelligence, and he's always been genuinely supportive of me, even when he didn't understand my choices. When I told him about my cryptocurrency success, his first reaction wasn't jealousy or disbelief. It was concern for my safety and future security. He immediately started researching the best ways to protect and grow wealth, connecting me with private bankers and investment advisors, and making sure I understood the long-term implications of sudden wealth. Which is why what happened next feels like such a betrayal, even now. About 2 years ago, Caleb started dating Natasha Pemberton, who worked as a senior marketing director at Pinnacle Communications, one of Millbrook's premier advertising agencies. Natasha was everything I wasn't: tall, blonde, effortlessly confident, and socially connected in ways that opened doors throughout the city's professional circles. She had the kind of presence that made restaurant hosts remember her name and made networking events revolve around her conversations. When Caleb first introduced us, I genuinely tried to like her. She was clearly intelligent, successful in her own right, and seemed to make my brother happy in ways I'd never seen before. But there was something about the way she looked at me during that first meeting, something in her smile that felt more like an assessment than a greeting. It was as if she was immediately categorizing me as irrelevant to her future plans with Caleb. Still, I gave her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she was nervous about meeting family. Maybe she was just naturally reserved with new people. Maybe I was being overly sensitive because I'd never been great at reading social situations. So I continued to be welcoming, continued to include her in family gatherings, and continued to believe that eventually we'd find our common ground. What I didn't realize was that Natasha had drawn her conclusions about me from day one, and nothing I did was going to change her mind. To her, I was the awkward younger sister who worked a boring job and lived a boring life. I was someone to be tolerated for Caleb's sake, but never someone to be taken seriously or treated as an equal. Everything changed on a rainy Thursday evening in March, exactly 6 weeks before their engagement party. I remember the date so clearly because it was the day my carefully constructed world of family harmony finally cracked beyond repair. I had been working late at the office, finishing up a quarterly analysis report for one of our major clients, when I received a text from Caleb asking if I could stop by their penthouse apartment. He mentioned something about needing help with some financial paperwork, and said Natasha would be working late at a client presentation, so it would just be the two of us. Since I rarely got one-on-one time with my brother anymore, I was actually looking forward to it. The penthouse they shared was a stunning 2-bedroom unit in the newly constructed Meridian Towers, overlooking Riverside Park and the city's financial district beyond. When Caleb had first told me about the apartment 18 months earlier, I'd been impressed but not surprised. Between his salary as a senior associate at Morrison & Associates and Natasha's income from Pinnacle Communications, they were clearly doing well for themselves. The rent was probably steep by normal standards, but manageable for 2 successful professionals in their late 20s. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't discover until that rainy Thursday evening, was that the apartment wasn't being paid for by their combined incomes. It wasn't even being paid for entirely by Caleb's salary. The truth was far more complicated and far more devastating than I could have imagined. I arrived at their building around 8:30 p.m., shaking the rain from my umbrella as the doorman nodded me toward the elevator, with the familiarity of someone who'd seen me visit many times before. The ride to the 23rd floor gave me a few moments to appreciate how far Caleb had come since our college days, when he'd shared a cramped studio apartment with a roommate who collected vintage comic books and left dirty dishes in the sink for weeks at a time. Caleb greeted me at the door with a hug and what I now recognize was a forced smile, though at the time I attributed his slightly tense demeanor to work stress. He'd been putting in long hours lately, working on a major acquisition deal that he'd mentioned was particularly complex and demanding. The dining room table was covered with financial documents, legal papers, and what appeared to be several months' worth of bank statements. "Thanks for coming over, Jazz," he said, using the childhood nickname that only family was allowed to use. "I know you're probably tired, but I really need your expertise on something, and I'd rather not involve anyone from the firm in this particular situation." He led me to the table and began explaining what he described as a temporary cash flow issue that had developed over the past few months. According to Caleb, a combination of unexpected expenses, delayed bonus payments, and some miscalculated budgeting had left them in a position where they were struggling to meet their monthly obligations without dipping into their long-term savings. As he talked, I found myself studying the bank statements spread across the table, and what I saw didn't align with the story he was telling me. These weren't the financial records of people experiencing temporary cash flow problems. These were the records of people who had been systematically overspending their income for months, possibly years. The monthly expenses were staggering. Beyond the $4,200 rent for the penthouse, there were charges for personal trainers, spa treatments, weekend trips to luxury resorts, designer clothing purchases, expensive dinners at Millbrook's most exclusive restaurants, and a car payment for Natasha's brand new BMW that was nearly as much as some people's mortgage payments. But what really caught my attention were the recurring charges I couldn't immediately identify: monthly payments to something called Grandview Membership Services, regular transfers to an account labeled NP Personal, and a series of cash withdrawals that totaled thousands of dollars each month, with no apparent documentation of where that money was being spent. "Caleb," I said carefully, trying to understand what I was looking at, "some of these expenses seem really high for temporary problems. How long has this been going on?" That's when his composure started to crack. He ran his hands through his hair in a gesture I remembered from childhood, something he only did when he was really worried about something. "That's just it, Jazz. It's not really temporary anymore. We've been using credit cards to cover the shortfalls, and now those are maxed out too. I've been trying to figure out how to handle this without having to ask for help, but I'm running out of options." He pulled out another set of papers that made my stomach drop. Credit card statements showing balances that totaled over $47,000 across 6 different accounts. Minimum payments that were eating up nearly a quarter of their combined monthly income. Interest rates that were compounding their debt faster than they could possibly pay it down with their current spending patterns. "How did this happen?" I asked, though part of me was already beginning to understand. "Caleb, you're one of the most financially responsible people I know. You helped me set up investment strategies that have protected millions of dollars. How did you let your own finances get to this point?" That's when he said something that would change everything between us, something that revealed a truth I'd never suspected and never wanted to hear. "The thing is, Jazz, most of this isn't really my spending. I mean, the apartment was my idea and I agreed to the car payments, but all these other expenses." He gestured vaguely at the statements. "Natasha has very specific ideas about the lifestyle we should be maintaining. She says it's important for our careers, for our social connections, for building the kind of life we want together long term." I stared at him, trying to process what he was telling me. "Are you saying that Natasha is making financial decisions that you can't afford?" "It's not that simple," he said quickly, and I could hear the defensiveness creeping into his voice. "She comes from a different background than we do. Her family has money, real money, and she's used to a certain standard of living. When we started dating seriously, she explained that maintaining appearances is crucial in her industry. Clients expect their marketing executives to look successful, to be connected with the right people, to understand luxury markets firsthand." The more he talked, the clearer the picture became. Natasha hadn't just encouraged expensive lifestyle choices, she'd made them prerequisites for their relationship. The penthouse apartment wasn't just a nice place to live, It was what she considered the minimum acceptable housing for a serious professional couple. The designer clothes weren't just fashion choices. They were investments in their shared career advancement. The expensive dinners and weekend trips weren't just fun experiences. They were networking opportunities and relationship-building exercises. And somehow Caleb had convinced himself that going into massive debt to fund this lifestyle was a reasonable sacrifice for love and career advancement. "So what exactly are you asking me to do?" I said, though I was starting to suspect I already knew the answer. Caleb took a deep breath, and I could see him gathering courage for whatever he was about to say next. "I was hoping you might be willing to help us out temporarily. Just until I get my next bonus, or until Natasha's promotion comes through, or until we can refinance some of this debt into more manageable payments." "Help you out how, specifically? Maybe you could cover our rent for a few months, or help us pay down some of the credit card debt. I know you've been doing really well with your investments, and I helped you set up all those legal structures. So I thought maybe—" And there it was. The moment when everything I thought I knew about my relationship with my brother revealed itself to be something else entirely. He wasn't asking for advice, or for help creating a budget, or for assistance finding a debt consolidation loan. He was asking me to use my secretly accumulated wealth to fund the lifestyle that his fiancée had decided was non-negotiable for their future together. The worst part wasn't the request itself. The worst part was the assumption underlying it. That my money existed primarily to solve other people's problems, and that my financial success was somehow less important or less deserving of protection than their desire to maintain appearances. That night, sitting in my modest apartment staring at the financial documents Caleb had asked me to review, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of simply writing him a check to solve his immediate problems, I decided to become a detective in my own family's life. Something about the whole situation felt wrong in ways I couldn't immediately articulate. It wasn't just the massive debt, though that was certainly shocking. It wasn't even Caleb's assumption that I should bail them out, though that stung more than I wanted to admit. What bothered me most was how quickly my intelligent, financially savvy brother had been convinced that destroying his credit and compromising his future was somehow a reasonable price to pay for love. I started with the bank statements he'd shown me, photographing each page with my phone before returning the originals the next day. What I discovered during my detailed analysis over the following weeks painted a picture that was even more disturbing than I'd initially realized. The spending patterns weren't random or impulsive. They were systematic and strategic. Every expensive purchase, every luxury experience, every status symbol acquisition followed a pattern that suggested careful planning rather than emotional overspending. Someone had been methodically escalating their lifestyle in ways designed to maximize financial dependency while maintaining plausible deniability. Using my background in financial analysis, I created detailed spreadsheets tracking their expenses over the past 18 months. What emerged was a clear timeline that corresponded exactly with major milestones in Caleb and Natasha's relationship. The penthouse apartment lease began 3 months after they moved in together. The BMW purchase happened 2 weeks after Caleb mentioned they were discussing engagement. The Grandview Country Club membership was initiated the same month Caleb received a promotion at his law firm. But here's what really caught my attention. The timing of these financial commitments consistently preceded increases in Caleb's income, not followed them. Someone was spending future money before it actually materialized, creating a cycle where each new expense required the next salary increase or bonus payment just to maintain the status quo. I decided to dig deeper, using resources I'd developed through my cryptocurrency investments to access financial databases and public records that most people don't know exist. What I found through property records, business filings, and professional licensing databases began to reveal a pattern of financial manipulation that was far more sophisticated than simple overspending. Natasha's background, which I'd never bothered to investigate before, turned out to be much more complex than the straightforward success story she presented. Her position at Pinnacle Communications was legitimate, but her tenure there was shorter than she'd led everyone to believe. According to employment records I accessed through professional networking databases, she'd been at the company for only 14 months, not the, quote, nearly 3 years she'd mentioned to our family. More concerning were the gaps in her employment history that didn't align with her carefully constructed narrative. There was an 8-month period where she appeared to have no documented income, followed by a series of short-term consulting contracts before landing the Pinnacle position. During those consulting months, she'd somehow maintained an expensive lifestyle that included luxury apartment rentals and high-end purchases that didn't match what someone in unstable employment should have been able to afford. The deeper I dug, the more questions emerged. Property records showed that Natasha had been evicted from 2 previous apartments for non-payment of rent, yet she'd somehow convinced landlords to approve her for increasingly expensive housing. Credit reports that I accessed through legitimate financial research channels revealed a pattern of opened and quickly maxed out credit accounts, followed by successful negotiations for increased credit limits despite payment irregularities. What became clear was that Natasha possessed an almost supernatural ability to convince financial institutions, landlords, and apparently romantic partners that she represented a low-risk investment, even when the objective evidence suggested otherwise. She wasn't just someone who liked expensive things. She was someone who had systematically perfected the art of living beyond her means while convincing other people to finance the difference. But the most damaging discovery came when I started investigating the monthly charges that had puzzled me on Caleb's bank statements. Those mysterious payments to Grandview membership services weren't just country club dues, as I'd initially assumed. They were payments for a premium membership level that included access to private dining rooms, exclusive social events, and what the club called executive networking privileges. When I called the club directly, pretending to be interested in membership myself, I learned that Natasha had been the one to initiate their membership application. She'd specifically requested the premium level, explaining to the membership coordinator that she and her fiancé needed access to the club's most exclusive amenities for business development purposes related to her marketing career. The membership coordinator, who was surprisingly forthcoming during our conversation, mentioned that Natasha had been very specific about wanting to host client events and networking gatherings that would establish their position among Millbrook's professional elite. She'd even requested information about the club's wedding and special event services, mentioning that they were planning an engagement party that would need to, quote, make the right impression on their combined professional networks. What struck me most was how the coordinator described Natasha's approach to the membership process. She hadn't just joined a club. She'd crafted a strategic plan for using that membership to elevate their social status in ways that would presumably generate business opportunities and career advancement for both of them. The problem was that neither of their actual careers required this level of social positioning, and the monthly costs were consuming nearly 15% of Caleb's take-home salary. The NP personal transfers that appeared monthly on their bank statements turned out to be even more troubling. Through careful detective work, I discovered that NP stood for Natasha Personal, and these weren't shared expenses or household contributions. They were direct payments from Caleb's checking account into a personal account that Natasha maintained separately from their joint finances. When I finally worked up the courage to ask Caleb about these transfers during one of our coffee meetings, his explanation revealed just how thoroughly he'd been convinced to accept financial arrangements that would have seemed outrageous to the old Caleb I knew. Natasha likes to maintain some financial independence, he explained, seeming almost proud of what he clearly viewed as a progressive relationship dynamic. She handles her own personal expenses, her own shopping, her own professional development costs. I transfer money to her each month, so she doesn't have to worry about asking permission or justifying every purchase. It's more respectful of her autonomy as a modern woman. The amount of these monthly transfers was $2,800. For context, that was more than I was paying in rent for my entire apartment, and it was money that Natasha was spending with no oversight, no shared decision-making, and apparently no requirement to demonstrate how it connected to their shared financial goals or household needs. But the discovery that changed everything, the piece of information that transformed my investigation from curiosity into alarm, came when I decided to research Natasha's previous relationships through social media archaeology and public record searches. What I found was a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Over the past 5 years, Natasha had been in 3 serious relationships with men, who all shared certain characteristics. They were successful professionals with stable incomes, they were somewhat introverted and family-oriented, and according to social media posts and public records, they had all experienced significant financial difficulties during or immediately after their relationships with her. One ex-boyfriend, a doctor, had been forced to sell his house and move back in with roommates after what appeared to be substantial credit card debt. Another, an engineer, had filed for bankruptcy protection 6 months after their breakup. The most recent ex, a financial planner ironically enough, had been forced to close his independent practice and take a corporate job after what court records suggested were business loans that had been used for personal expenses. The pattern was clear, methodical, and terrifying. Natasha wasn't just someone who happened to be expensive to date. She was someone who systematically identified successful men, convinced them to overextend financially to support a lifestyle she presented as necessary for their mutual success, and then moved on to the next target before the financial consequences became irreversible for her. My brother wasn't just being manipulated, he was being systematically harvested. Armed with evidence that painted a devastating picture of Natasha's true nature, I faced the most difficult decision of my life. How do you tell someone you love that the person they're planning to marry is a predator who has systematically destroyed multiple men's financial lives? How do you convince your brother that he's not the exception to a pattern, but simply the latest victim in a carefully orchestrated scheme? I knew that approaching Caleb directly with my findings would be catastrophic. He was already emotionally invested in defending Natasha's lifestyle demands, already convinced that their financial struggles were temporary setbacks rather than the inevitable result of unsustainable spending. If I simply presented him with evidence of her past relationships and their tragic outcomes, he would dismiss it as coincidence, jealousy, or misunderstanding. Worse yet, he would tell Natasha about my investigation, giving her the opportunity to craft explanations, manipulate his emotions, and potentially accelerate whatever timeline she was working toward. I'd seen enough evidence of her psychological manipulation to know that she was far more skilled at managing perception than I was at presenting facts. So I made a decision that felt both calculated and necessary. I was going to let Natasha expose herself, in the most public and undeniable way possible. The engagement party provided the perfect opportunity, though it would require weeks of careful preparation to execute properly. The event was scheduled for a Saturday evening at the Grandview Country Club, with approximately 50 guests from their combined professional and social networks. Natasha had been planning this party for months, treating it as what she called, quote, the social event that would establish their position in Millbrook's power structure. The guest list itself was revealing. Rather than focusing on close friends and family, Natasha had insisted on inviting people who could advance their careers. Senior partners from Caleb's law firm, major clients from her marketing agency, influential members of the country club, and several couples she described as socially strategic connections. This wasn't a celebration of their relationship. It was a networking event designed to solidify the image of success that she'd been constructing through debt and deception. My plan was elegantly simple in concept, but would require precise timing and careful psychological preparation to execute successfully. I was going to become the financial benefactor that Natasha apparently believed I already was, but I was going to do it in a way that would expose the true nature of our relationship dynamic in front of everyone who mattered to her social ambitions. First, I needed to establish a paper trail that would support my eventual revelation. Over the course of 3 weeks, I began systematically paying for elements of Caleb and Natasha's lifestyle through carefully structured transactions that would be impossible to deny or explain away. I started with their rent. Instead of giving Caleb cash to cover their monthly housing costs, I contacted their property management company directly and arranged to pay their lease for the next 6 months through a wire transfer from one of my investment accounts. When the property manager asked for authorization, I explained that I was Caleb's sister and was helping them during a temporary financial transition. The manager was happy to accept payment from a family member, especially since the account had been occasionally late in recent months. Next, I targeted the country club membership that was consuming such a large portion of their monthly budget. A single phone call to the club's billing department, along with a wire transfer covering their membership fees for the next year, ensured that their account would reflect my payment history rather than Caleb's struggling monthly installments. The BMW payment was more complex, but not impossible. Auto loan companies are accustomed to receiving payments from sources other than the primary borrower, especially when family members are involved. I simply called Natasha's lender, explained that I was helping my future sister-in-law with her car payments as an engagement gift, and arranged for automatic monthly payments to be deducted from one of my accounts. Each transaction was legal, properly documented, and completely traceable. More importantly, each payment created an official record, showing that someone other than Caleb and Natasha was funding the lifestyle that Natasha had been presenting as evidence of their combined success. But payments alone wouldn't be enough to create the dramatic revelation I was planning. I needed Natasha to publicly acknowledge her assumptions about my role in their lives, and to do so in a way that would make my eventual correction impossible to dismiss or explain away. This required what I can only describe as psychological bait. Over the weeks leading up to the engagement party, I began subtly reinforcing Natasha's existing beliefs about my financial situation, while providing just enough contradictory evidence to create cognitive dissonance that would eventually explode into public confrontation. I started showing up to family gatherings wearing obviously expensive accessories, a watch that costs more than most people's monthly salary, shoes that any fashion-conscious person would recognize as luxury designer pieces, a handbag that I knew Natasha had been coveting but couldn't afford. When she commented on these items, I would deflect with vague explanations about saving up for something special, or treating myself occasionally. The goal was to plant seeds of suspicion in her mind without providing clear explanations that she could process and categorize. I wanted her to notice the discrepancy between my supposedly modest income and my increasingly obvious wealth, but I wanted her to reach her own conclusions about where that money was coming from. Simultaneously, I began making casual comments that reinforced her perception of me as financially dependent on family support. I would mention concerns about job security, complaints about student loan payments, and anxiety about finding a better apartment, all technically true statements that painted a picture of financial struggle while carefully avoiding any direct lies about my actual circumstances. The psychological effect was exactly what I'd hoped for. Natasha began treating me with a mixture of condescension and curiosity that grew more pronounced each time we interacted. She would make pointed comments about financial responsibility, offer unsolicited advice about career advancement, and increasingly position herself as the successful adult in the room who was generously tolerating the presence of Caleb's struggling younger sister. More importantly, she began making assumptions about my relationship with Caleb that revealed her true understanding of family dynamics and financial obligation. During one particularly memorable dinner, she actually suggested that I should be more grateful for how much Caleb had helped me over the years, and that perhaps it was time for me to stand on my own feet instead of relying on family support. The irony was exquisite, but I maintained my role perfectly. I nodded along with her advice, thanked her for her concern, and even asked for her guidance on professional development strategies. Each interaction reinforced her perception of herself as the sophisticated mentor and me as the grateful recipient of wisdom and tolerance. 2 weeks before the engagement party, I implemented the final phase of my preparation. I arranged for what I presented as a small family contribution to help with party expenses. Specifically, I paid for the catering, the floral arrangements, and the photography services. When Caleb expressed surprise and gratitude for my generosity, I explained that I'd been saving money specifically for this purpose and wanted to contribute to making their engagement celebration special. Natasha's reaction to this news was telling. Rather than gratitude or surprise, she displayed what I can only describe as vindicated satisfaction. This financial contribution apparently confirmed her existing beliefs about the family dynamic and my role within it. She began referring to my contribution as evidence of how family comes together to support important milestones, positioning herself as the deserving recipient of collective family investment in her future happiness. The stage was set. Natasha had been psychologically primed to view me as both financially dependent on Caleb and financially obligated to support their lifestyle. She had publicly positioned herself as the sophisticated partner who was generously tolerating and guiding the struggling younger sister. And she had built her entire social identity around a lifestyle that she believed was funded by their combined professional success. All that remained was to choose the perfect moment during the engagement party to reveal that every assumption she'd made about money, power, and family dynamics was not just wrong, but completely backwards. And I knew exactly when that moment would come. The day of the engagement party arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that makes everything feel sharper and more defined. I woke up at 6 a.m., not because I had set an alarm, but because my mind was already racing through the final details of what I'd come to think of as my moment of truth. Every element had to be perfect. The timing, the witnesses, the undeniable evidence, and, most importantly, the psychological pressure that would force Natasha to reveal her true character in front of the exact audience she'd been working so hard to impress. I spent the morning reviewing the financial documents I'd prepared, printed copies of every payment I'd made on their behalf, bank statements showing the wire transfers, confirmation numbers from the property management company, the country club, and the auto loan servicer. Everything was organized in a leather portfolio that I would keep with me throughout the evening, ready to present at exactly the right moment. The engagement party was scheduled to begin at 7 p.m. with cocktails and networking, followed by dinner at 8:30, and speeches during dessert around 10 p.m. Based on my observations of Natasha's behavior patterns over the past few months, I knew she would use the cocktail hour to work the room, introducing herself and Caleb to the most influential guests, and establishing the social connections she viewed as essential to their future success. I also knew that she would eventually make some kind of public comment about me. It was inevitable, given how she'd been positioning herself as the tolerant, sophisticated partner who was graciously accepting the burden of Caleb's dependent sister. The question wasn't whether she would say something revealing, but when and how dramatically she would choose to do it. I arrived at the Grandview Country Club at exactly 6:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the official start time. This gave me the opportunity to observe the setup and confirm that everything was in place. The main ballroom looked absolutely stunning. The floral arrangements I'd secretly paid for created an atmosphere of understated elegance, while the catering stations were already prepared with the kind of sophisticated hors d'oeuvres that Natasha had insisted were necessary to establish the right tone for their social debut. The guest list was even more impressive in person than it had been on paper. I recognized several senior partners from Morrison & Associates, including the managing partner who would likely determine Caleb's path to partnership over the next few years. Representatives from Pinnacle Communications were chatting near the bar, along with clients whose accounts Natasha had mentioned as crucial to her career advancement. The social connections were equally strategic. Couples who belonged to the city's most exclusive organizations, business leaders whose networking could open doors for years to come. This wasn't just an engagement party. It was Natasha's debut as someone who belonged among Millbrook's professional elite. Every detail had been carefully chosen to project success, sophistication, and social connectivity. The irony, of course, was that none of the attendees realized they were celebrating a relationship built on debt, deception, and financial manipulation. I positioned myself strategically near the bar, where I could observe the room while remaining relatively inconspicuous. My outfit had been chosen as carefully as everything else. A simple black dress that Natasha had previously dismissed as basic, paired with jewelry that anyone with knowledge of luxury brands would recognize as extraordinarily expensive. The contrast was deliberate. I wanted to look understated enough that Natasha would feel confident about making disparaging comments, while wearing pieces valuable enough that informed observers would question any assumptions about my financial status. The first hour proceeded exactly as I'd predicted. Natasha worked the room with impressive skill, introducing Caleb to potential business connections and presenting their relationship as a partnership between two rising stars in their respective fields. She was charming, articulate, and convincing in her role as the successful marketing executive who had found love with an equally accomplished attorney. But I noticed something that I doubt anyone else picked up on: the way she monitored the room's reactions to their lifestyle indicators. She would casually mention their penthouse apartment while discussing real estate markets with other couples. She would reference their recent weekend trips while talking about travel recommendations. She would compliment other women's jewelry while subtly displaying her own engagement ring, which caught the light beautifully and clearly represented a significant financial investment. Each of these references was designed to establish their position in the social hierarchy, to demonstrate that they belonged among people who could afford luxury experiences and exclusive memberships. What Natasha didn't realize was that several of the guests had been privately questioning how two young professionals could afford such an obviously expensive lifestyle, and her casual references were creating curiosity rather than admiration. Around 8:15 p.m., just as guests were beginning to move toward their dinner tables, I observed the moment I'd been waiting for. Natasha was standing near the center of the room, surrounded by a group that included two senior partners from Caleb's firm, a major client from her agency, and several influential country club members. The conversation had naturally turned to family dynamics and the challenges of blending different backgrounds in serious relationships. "It's actually been quite an adjustment," Natasha was saying, her voice carrying just enough projection that people at nearby tables could overhear. "Caleb comes from such a close-knit family, which is wonderful, but it does mean navigating some complex dynamics. His sister Jasmine, for example, has been going through a difficult period with her career and finances, so she's been staying with us while she gets back on her feet." The group made appropriately sympathetic noises while I felt my pulse quicken. This was exactly the kind of public misrepresentation I'd been hoping she would make, delivered to exactly the audience that would make her eventual humiliation most complete. But she wasn't finished. "It's challenging sometimes, you know? Caleb has such a generous heart, and he wants to help family members who are struggling. But there's a balance between being supportive and enabling dependency. I've been trying to encourage Jasmine to focus on building her own independent life, rather than relying on us indefinitely." One of the law firm partners, a woman named Catherine Winters, who I recognized from Caleb's previous descriptions, looked genuinely concerned. "That must be difficult for both of you. Family financial dynamics can be so complicated, especially when you're trying to build your own life together." "Exactly," Natasha continued, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice as she positioned herself as the mature, responsible partner dealing with an unfortunate family situation. "We want to be helpful, but we also need to maintain boundaries. It's not fair to expect us to carry the financial burden of supporting extended family members who aren't willing to take responsibility for their own circumstances." The conversation was drawing attention from other nearby groups, partly because Natasha's voice had become slightly louder as she warmed to her theme, and partly because discussions of family financial drama always attract interested listeners at social gatherings. "The hardest part," she continued, "is that some people develop a sense of entitlement about family support. They start to expect others to solve their problems, rather than working to solve them independently. It becomes this cycle where they're always asking for help but never actually addressing the underlying issues that created their difficulties in the first place. I glanced around the room and noticed that several other conversations had quieted as people began listening to what was clearly becoming a more dramatic monologue than Natasha had probably intended. But she was on a roll now, emboldened by the sympathetic attention and apparently confident that she was establishing herself as the reasonable voice in a difficult family situation. I mean, at some point you have to ask yourself, are we actually helping this person by constantly bailing them out, or are we just enabling them to avoid taking responsibility for their own lives? It's a difficult conversation to have with someone you love, but sometimes tough love is what's really needed. That's when Catherine Winters asked the question that would set everything in motion. Does Jasmine contribute anything to the household expenses, or is it completely one-sided? Natasha's expression shifted slightly, and I could see her calculating how much detail she could share without seeming unnecessarily harsh. But her desire to position herself as the generous benefactor overrode her caution. Well, she tries to help with small things here and there, but honestly, her financial situation is so precarious that anything she contributes is really just symbolic. The reality is that Caleb and I are covering all the real expenses: the rent, the car payments, the club memberships, all the actual costs of maintaining the lifestyle we've built together. The moment had arrived. Everything was in position, all the witnesses were present, and Natasha had just made the most perfect setup statement I could have possibly hoped for. I stood up from my place at the bar, walked deliberately toward the center of the room, and prepared to deliver the revelation that would change everything. The walk from the bar to the center of the room felt like it took both forever and no time at all. Every step was deliberate, measured, designed to draw attention without appearing theatrical. By the time I reached the edge of Natasha's circle of listeners, the conversations at nearby tables had naturally quieted, as people sensed that something significant was about to happen. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the suddenly attentive ballroom, "but I couldn't help overhearing your conversation about family financial dynamics, and I think there might be some confusion that needs to be cleared up." Natasha turned toward me with an expression that was equal parts surprise and annoyance. She clearly hadn't expected me to insert myself into what she considered adult conversation, and her smile had the kind of patronizing quality that adults use when children interrupt important discussions. "Oh, Jasmine," she said, her voice taking on that carefully modulated tone she used when she wanted to sound generous while actually being dismissive. "We were just discussing how challenging it can be to navigate family support systems. Nothing you need to worry about." The condescension in her voice was so obvious that I saw several of the listening guests exchange glances. Catherine Winters, in particular, looked uncomfortable with the dynamic she was witnessing, though she couldn't have understood why yet. "Actually," I replied, pulling out my phone and opening the banking app that would provide the first piece of evidence, "I think this is exactly something I need to be part of, especially since you're discussing my financial situation with people who might have the wrong impression about our family dynamics." I could see Caleb from across the room, frozen in conversation with two of his law firm colleagues, his face showing the kind of confusion that comes from hearing your name mentioned in what sounds like an increasingly tense discussion. "Natasha," I continued, holding up my phone so the transaction history was visible to anyone who cared to look, "you just told this group that you and Caleb cover all the real expenses for your lifestyle, the rent, the car payments, the club memberships. Is that really what you believe?" Her confidence faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Well, yes, of course, that's what I believe. Caleb and I are the ones working full-time jobs, paying the bills, maintaining our household. You've been staying with us while you figure out your career situation." The murmur that went through the gathered guests was subtle but unmistakable. Several people were now openly staring at what was clearly becoming a family confrontation, at what should have been a celebration. That's interesting, I said, my voice remaining calm and measured, because according to my bank records, I've been the one paying your rent for the past 6 months. Would you like to see the wire transfer confirmations? The change in Natasha's expression was immediate and dramatic. The patronizing smile disappeared entirely, replaced by something that looked like genuine confusion mixed with the first hint of panic. That's not possible, she stammered, but I could see the doubt creeping into her voice. Caleb handles all our financial arrangements. You don't even have access to our accounts. You're absolutely right, I agreed, pulling out the leather portfolio I'd been carrying all evening. I don't have access to your accounts. But I do have access to mine, and I have documentation of every payment I've made on your behalf. I opened the portfolio and began laying out printed bank statements on the nearest cocktail table, each document showing wire transfers with dates, amounts, and recipient information clearly visible. Here's the payment to Meridian Towers Property Management for your penthouse rent, 6 months paid in advance. Here's the payment to Grandview Country Club for your membership fees, 12 months paid in advance. And here, I placed the final document on top of the others, is the payment arrangement I made with BMW Financial Services for Natasha's car loan. The silence that followed was deafening. 50 of Millbrook's most influential residents were staring at documents that contradicted everything they'd just heard about family financial dynamics, and Natasha was staring at evidence that her entire understanding of her own life was completely wrong. I don't understand, she whispered, and for the first time since I'd known her, she sounded genuinely vulnerable rather than calculating. Caleb told me he was handling all of our expenses. He never mentioned, how is this possible? That's when Caleb himself appeared at the edge of our circle, having crossed the room when he realized that whatever was happening involved financial documents and increasingly dramatic revelations. Jasmine, what's going on? He asked, though his voice suggested he was beginning to suspect that whatever was happening was going to change everything he thought he knew about his own life. I'm explaining to your fiancé, I said, turning to include him in the conversation while ensuring that our audience could still hear every word, that the lifestyle she's been attributing to your combined professional success has actually been funded by someone else entirely. I picked up one of the bank statements and handed it to him. Remember when you asked me for help with your temporary cash flow problems? Instead of just giving you money that would disappear into the same spending patterns that created the problem, I decided to address the underlying expenses directly. Caleb studied the document, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and dawning horror as he realized what he was looking at. You've been paying our rent? He asked, his voice barely audible. Your rent, her car payment, your club membership, and as of this week, I've also covered the catering, flowers, and photography for tonight's party. I gestured around the beautifully appointed ballroom. Essentially, every element of the lifestyle that Natasha has been presenting as evidence of your financial success has been subsidized by the sister she just finished describing as a financial burden. The crowd of listeners had grown as word spread through the ballroom that something dramatic was unfolding. I could see phones being discreetly pulled out as people realized they were witnessing what would undoubtedly become legendary gossip in Millbrook's social circles. Natasha, meanwhile, had gone completely pale. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the fact that her face had lost all color, and her hands were shaking as she tried to process information that contradicted everything she thought she understood about her own relationship. But the money, she said weakly, Caleb always had money for everything. He paid for dinners, he bought me gifts, he never acted like we couldn't afford anything. That's because he was using credit cards to maintain the illusion of financial stability, I explained, pulling out another set of documents. Credit cards that are now maxed out to the tune of $47,000 in debt, which is why he originally asked for my help. The collective gasp from our audience was audible. Several people actually stepped closer to get a better look at the documents, while others began whispering urgently to their companions about what they were witnessing. Catherine Winters, the law firm partner who had been asking questions earlier, spoke into the stunned silence. "Are you saying that this young woman has been financially supporting your household while you presented her as dependent on your generosity?" Natasha opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She looked from me to Caleb, to the documents spread across the table, her face showing the kind of complete cognitive dissonance that occurs when someone's entire reality is revealed to be an illusion. "I think," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the now completely silent ballroom, "what we're saying is that assumptions about who holds financial power in family relationships can be very dangerous, especially when those assumptions are used to justify treating people as burdens rather than recognizing them as benefactors." That's when Natasha's legs gave out completely, not a graceful faint or a calculated swoon, but a genuine collapse that sent her designer gown billowing around her as she hit the marble floor with an undignified thud that echoed through the shocked silence of the room. But even as several people rushed to help her, even as the carefully orchestrated engagement party dissolved into chaos and urgent conversations, I wasn't finished. Because the financial revelations, devastating as they weren't the only truth that needed to come to light that evening. The seconds immediately following Natasha's collapse felt like watching a movie in slow motion. The sound of her body hitting the marble floor seemed to echo endlessly through the ballroom, followed by the kind of absolute silence that only occurs when an entire room of people simultaneously realizes they've witnessed something that will be talked about for years to come. Dr. Phillips, a cardiologist who happened to be among the guests, was the first to respond, kneeling beside Natasha and checking her pulse while asking someone to bring water. But even as he tended to her, his professional attention was clearly divided by curiosity about the financial documents that remained spread across the cocktail table like evidence at a crime scene. Caleb stood frozen, staring down at his unconscious fiancée with an expression that cycled between concern, confusion, and something that looked remarkably like the dawning realization that his entire life had been built on foundations he'd never bothered to examine. His hands shook as he held the bank statements I'd given him, and I could practically see him mentally reviewing every conversation, every expense, every assumption he'd made about their relationship dynamic. "Is she okay?" he asked Dr. Phillips, but his voice had the detached quality of someone whose emotional processing system had temporarily shut down from overload. "Physically, she appears to be fine," Dr. Phillips replied while helping Natasha into a sitting position against the wall. "This looks like a vasovagal response. Essentially, her blood pressure dropped suddenly, probably due to shock or extreme stress. She should recover fully in a few minutes." "This can't be real," she whispered, her voice carrying a note of desperation that I'd never heard from her before. "There has to be some mistake. Caleb, tell them there's been some kind of misunderstanding." But Caleb was studying the bank statements with the focused attention of someone trained to analyze complex legal documents. And what he was finding was clearly not providing the reassurance Natasha was hoping for. "The dates match," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "The amounts correspond exactly to our monthly expenses. And these account numbers." He looked up at me with an expression that was equal parts amazement and horror. "Jasmine, how long have you been covering our living expenses?" 6 months for the major items," I replied, maintaining the calm professional tone that was clearly driving everyone in the room slightly crazy. "Longer for some of the smaller recurring charges. I have a complete breakdown if you'd like to review it." Catherine Winters, who had moved closer to get a better view of the documents, spoke up with the kind of sharp legal mind that had made her a senior partner before age 40. "I'm trying to understand the timeline here. Natasha, when you were describing the financial support arrangement, you said that Jasmine had been staying with you while getting back on her feet. How long has that been going on?" Natasha struggled to stand up, accepting help from Dr. Phillips while clearly trying to regain some composure and control over the situation. "She's been with us for about 8 months, she said, her voice still shaky but regaining some of its usual confidence. ever since she lost her apartment and was having trouble making ends meet. The look that Catherine exchanged with several other legal professionals in the group was one of professional skepticism that comes from years of identifying inconsistencies in testimony. But if Jasmine has been paying your major expenses for 6 months, Catherine continued, and she's supposedly been financially dependent on you for 8 months, then there's a 2-month period where you were supporting her before she started supporting you. Can you walk us through what changed during those 2 months? I watched Natasha's face as she realized she was being cross-examined by one of the city's most respected attorneys in front of an audience that included multiple lawyers, business executives, and social leaders, who were all now paying very close attention to her answers. It's complicated, Natasha stammered, clearly struggling to construct a narrative that would make sense of the contradictory evidence. Maybe Jasmine had some kind of windfall. Or maybe she was hiding assets. Or maybe, I interrupted gently, you never actually knew anything about my financial situation because you never bothered to ask questions that might complicate the story you wanted to tell about family dynamics. I pulled out another document from my portfolio, this one showing the balance in one of my investment accounts as of that morning. The number was large enough that several people actually leaned forward to make sure they were reading it correctly. You see, Natasha, the struggling sister narrative was never based on reality. It was based on assumptions you made because believing I was financially dependent allowed you to position yourself as the generous benefactor who was graciously tolerating the burden of extended family obligations. Robert Morrison, the managing partner of Caleb's law firm, stepped closer to examine the investment account statement. His expression shifted from curiosity to something approaching professional respect as he processed the implications of what he was seeing. Jasmine, he said carefully, this account balance suggests that you're operating at a level of financial sophistication that most people never achieve. How exactly did you accumulate this level of wealth while maintaining the impression that you were struggling financially? Cryptocurrency investments, I replied simply. I identified several undervalued opportunities early in their development cycles and invested accordingly. The returns were substantial enough to create generational wealth, but I chose to maintain a modest lifestyle while I learned how to manage sudden financial success responsibly. The murmur that went through the crowd was different this time, less shocked gossip and more professional intrigue. Several people were clearly recalculating their assumptions about me based on this new information, while others were beginning to understand that they'd witnessed something far more complex than a simple family financial dispute. But Natasha wasn't ready to accept this revised version of reality.
That's impossible, she said, her voice taking on a desperate edge. People don't just accidentally become millionaires from internet coins. If you had that kind of money, why were you living in a tiny apartment? Why were you driving an old car? Why were you pretending to struggle? I wasn't pretending to struggle, I corrected. I was choosing to live modestly while I learned how to handle wealth responsibly. There's a difference between having money and flaunting money, though apparently that's a distinction you've never learned to make. The implications of this statement weren't lost on the assembled guests, many of whom had spent the evening admiring the expensive lifestyle indicators that Natasha had been displaying as evidence of their success. Caleb, meanwhile, had moved from studying individual bank statements to examining the complete portfolio of financial documents I'd brought. His legal training was clearly helping him piece together a comprehensive picture that was becoming more shocking with each new detail he discovered. Jasmine, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. According to these records, you've spent over $60,000 supporting our lifestyle in the past 6 months alone. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you explain that you were capable of this level of financial assistance? Because, I replied, looking directly at Natasha as I answered, I wanted to see how long someone would be willing to accept financial support while simultaneously complaining about the burden of providing financial support. It was a fascinating study in cognitive dissonance and financial manipulation. The room fell silent again as people processed the psychological implications of what I'd just described. Several guests were now looking at Natasha with expressions that ranged from confusion to something approaching disgust, as they realized they'd been witnessing a masterclass in manipulation and entitlement. But Natasha wasn't finished fighting. "You're making me sound like some kind of gold digger," she said, her voice rising with anger and desperation. "But everything I did for us. The apartment, the memberships, the lifestyle choices, they were investments in our future together. I was building the kind of life that would create opportunities for both of us." "Using money that wasn't yours," Catherine Winters observed dryly, while publicly criticizing the person who was actually providing that money for being financially irresponsible. And that's when the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place for everyone in the room, creating a moment of collective understanding that would change how every person present thought about assumptions, appearances, and the dangers of judging people based on incomplete information. 6 months later, I sat in my new office overlooking Riverside Park, reviewing the quarterly reports for Moreau Financial Consulting, the wealth management firm I'd established in the aftermath of that unforgettable engagement party. The view from the 15th floor of the Millennium Tower was spectacular, but what I appreciated most was the symbolism. I was finally living and working in a space that reflected my actual circumstances rather than maintaining a facade for other people's comfort. The business had grown beyond my wildest expectations. Word travels fast in professional circles, especially when it involves someone who had quietly accumulated substantial wealth, while everyone around them made incorrect assumptions about their financial status. Within weeks of that evening at the Grandview Country Club, I was receiving calls from successful professionals who wanted advice on building wealth without attracting unwanted attention, managing sudden financial windfalls, and navigating family dynamics when money created complicated power imbalances. My specialty became what I called stealth wealth management, helping people build and preserve substantial assets while maintaining the freedom to choose how much of their success they revealed to the world. The irony wasn't lost on me that my most valuable business insight had come from watching how people reacted when they discovered that their assumptions about other people's finances were completely wrong. The engagement party had become legendary in Millbrook's social circles, though the story had evolved and expanded with each retelling. Some versions focused on the dramatic financial revelations, others on Natasha's collapse, and a few particularly creative accounts included details that I was quite certain had never actually happened. But the core truth remained consistent across all versions. People had witnessed a masterclass in why assumptions about other people's circumstances could be both dangerous and humiliating. Caleb and I had spent many long conversations working through the implications of what had happened that night. The immediate aftermath had been devastating for him. Not just the public embarrassment, though that was certainly difficult, but the realization that his perception of our family dynamics had been so fundamentally incorrect that he'd built major life decisions on false premises. The hardest part for him wasn't even the financial deception, though discovering that he'd been living beyond his means while someone else quietly covered the difference was certainly humbling. What really shook him was understanding how completely he'd bought into Natasha's narrative about family obligations, financial responsibility, and social positioning, without ever questioning whether her perspective aligned with reality. "I keep going back to specific conversations," he told me during one of our coffee meetings at the small cafe we'd started frequenting for these difficult discussions. "Moments when she would make comments about you that I just accepted as reasonable observations from someone who was dealing with challenging family dynamics. I never thought to ask myself whether her characterizations matched what I actually knew about you." The dissolution of his engagement had been swift and decisive. Within days of the party, Natasha had moved out of the penthouse apartment, though not before attempting to negotiate some kind of financial settlement that would have involved my continued support during her, quote, transition period. When Caleb refused to even discuss the possibility, she'd threatened legal action based on what she claimed were verbal agreements about long-term financial arrangements. That threat had evaporated quickly when Catherine Winters, who had apparently been so intrigued by the evening's revelations that she'd volunteered to provide legal advice, pointed out that any court proceeding would require documentation of the actual financial relationships involved. Since those documents would prove that Natasha had been receiving support rather than providing it, pursuing legal action would likely result in outcomes that were the opposite of what she hoped to achieve. The last I'd heard, Natasha had moved to another state and was working for a marketing firm that specialized in luxury brand positioning. Several mutual acquaintances had mentioned seeing social media posts that suggested she'd found another successful professional to date, though whether she'd learned anything from her experience with our family remained an open question. More interesting to me were the long-term consequences for the people who had witnessed the engagement party revelations. Catherine Winters had become something of a mentor, introducing me to other professional women who had built substantial wealth and helping me navigate the social complexities that came with sudden visibility in financial circles. Through her connections, I'd been invited to speak at several professional conferences about wealth management strategies for young entrepreneurs. Robert Morrison, the managing partner at Caleb's firm, had taken a particularly strong interest in the lessons that could be learned from what he'd witnessed that night. He'd actually asked me to present a seminar for the firm's attorneys about identifying and avoiding assumptions that could damage professional relationships. The presentation had gone so well that he'd recommended me to other law firms and corporate clients who wanted training on financial literacy and wealth management. But perhaps the most significant long-term outcome was the change in how Caleb and I related to each other as siblings. The experience had forced us to have conversations about money, family dynamics, and personal values that we'd somehow managed to avoid for our entire adult lives. We discovered that we had very different philosophies about wealth, success, and social positioning. But we'd also developed a much more honest and authentic relationship built on actual understanding rather than assumptions. Caleb had moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment that he could comfortably afford on his actual salary, and had spent months working with a financial advisor to develop a realistic budget and debt repayment plan. The credit card debt that had seemed so overwhelming when spread across 6 different accounts turned out to be manageable when approached systematically and without the pressure of maintaining an unsustainable lifestyle. More importantly, he'd begun making decisions based on his own values and goals, rather than trying to meet standards set by someone else's vision of what his life should look like. He'd started dating again, but with a completely different approach that prioritized emotional compatibility and shared values over social positioning and lifestyle alignment.
I think the most valuable thing I learned, he'd told me recently, is that financial compatibility isn't about having the same amount of money. It's about having similar attitudes toward money and being honest about your actual circumstances rather than trying to maintain an image that doesn't match reality. The professional networking consequences had been overwhelmingly positive for both of us. Caleb's colleagues at Morrison & Associates had actually gained respect for how he'd handled the aftermath of the engagement party crisis, particularly his willingness to take responsibility for his financial mistakes and his commitment to rebuilding his life on more sustainable foundations. Several senior partners had mentioned that his experience with family financial dynamics had made him more effective at counseling clients who were dealing with similar issues. For me, the visibility that came from that dramatic evening had opened doors I'd never expected. Beyond the consulting business, I'd been invited to join the boards of several nonprofit organizations focused on financial literacy and women's entrepreneurship. The investment portfolio that had started with cryptocurrency speculation had evolved into a diversified wealth management strategy that was generating enough passive income to support both my lifestyle and substantial charitable giving. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the number of young women who had reached out to me for advice about building wealth while navigating family and social pressures that discouraged financial independence. Many of them had stories similar to mine. They'd achieved financial success but felt pressured to downplay or hide their accomplishments to avoid making other people uncomfortable. Through mentoring these women, I'd realized that the engagement party confrontation had been about much more than exposing one person's manipulation and entitlement. It had been about challenging the broader assumption that financial power should always align with social expectations, and that people who don't fit traditional narratives about wealth and success should remain invisible to avoid disrupting other people's comfort zones. The lesson that emerged from all of this wasn't just about money, though financial literacy was certainly important. It was about the courage to live authentically rather than performing whatever version of yourself makes other people most comfortable, even when authenticity requires difficult conversations and sometimes dramatic revelations. Looking back now, 18 months after that life-changing evening at the Grandview Country Club, I realized that the most important lessons from this experience have very little to do with money and everything to do with the stories we tell ourselves about other people and the stories we allow other people to tell about us. The truth is, I could have avoided the entire dramatic confrontation. I could have simply written Caleb a check when he first asked for help, solved his immediate financial problems, and continued living quietly while Natasha maintained her narrative about family dynamics and financial responsibility. Many people would argue that approach would have been kinder, more diplomatic, and certainly less publicly humiliating for everyone involved. But here's what I've learned about kindness. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their self-destructive choices, even when that refusal creates immediate conflict and discomfort. By allowing Natasha to continue believing that manipulation and financial irresponsibility were sustainable strategies for building relationships, I wouldn't have been protecting her. I would have been setting her up for even more devastating failures in the future. The same principle applied to Caleb. By quietly covering his expenses without addressing the underlying problems that had created his financial crisis, I would have been treating symptoms rather than causes. His willingness to go into massive debt to fund someone else's lifestyle expectations wasn't just a temporary cash flow problem, it was a fundamental misunderstanding of financial boundaries, personal values, and relationship dynamics that would have destroyed his future if left uncorrected. What I discovered through this experience is that most people operate on a series of assumptions about how the world works, particularly regarding money, family obligations, and social hierarchies. These assumptions become so deeply embedded in their thinking that they rarely question whether their beliefs align with actual evidence. Natasha assumed that financial power must align with visible lifestyle indicators, so she never considered that someone living modestly might actually possess substantial wealth. Caleb assumed that family financial support naturally flowed from older to younger siblings, so he never questioned whether his understanding of our circumstances was accurate. The engagement party confrontation wasn't really about exposing one person's deception. It was about challenging a whole system of assumptions that had allowed that deception to flourish unchecked. Every person in that ballroom had made judgments about family dynamics, financial responsibility, and social positioning based on incomplete information and cultural stereotypes. The dramatic revelation forced them to confront how wrong those judgments could be, and how dangerous it was to make important decisions based on assumptions rather than verified facts. This principle extends far beyond family financial dynamics. In my consulting work, I've encountered countless situations where people's assumptions about wealth, success, and financial responsibility have created unnecessary conflict and missed opportunities. I've worked with families where parents assumed their adult children were financially irresponsible, only to discover that those children had actually achieved substantial financial success, but were hiding it to avoid family pressure and expectations. I've counseled couples where one partner's assumptions about the other's financial priorities had created years of resentment based on complete misunderstandings. The most common pattern I see is people making assumptions about other people's financial circumstances based on visible lifestyle indicators, without ever having direct conversations about actual financial realities. Someone drives an old car and lives in a modest apartment, so they must be struggling financially. Someone wears expensive clothes and lives in a luxury building, so they must be financially successful. Someone asks for financial help, so they must be less financially capable than the person they're asking. But here's what I've learned. Visible wealth often indicates spending patterns rather than actual financial security, while invisible wealth often indicates financial discipline and long-term planning rather than lack of resources. The people who appear most financially successful are sometimes living paycheck to paycheck while maintaining expensive facades, while the people who appear most financially modest are sometimes building generational wealth through careful investment and lifestyle choices. The key insight that emerged from my experience with Natasha and Caleb is that financial authenticity requires courage, the courage to live according to your actual values and circumstances rather than performing whatever version of financial success other people expect or demand. This means being willing to disappoint people who have made incorrect assumptions about your resources, your obligations, or your priorities. For me, this meant accepting that some people would never understand why I chose to live modestly despite having substantial wealth, or why I refused to automatically solve other people's financial problems just because I had the resources to do so. It meant recognizing that my wealth was a tool for creating the life I wanted, rather than a resource that existed primarily to meet other people's expectations or solve their problems. But perhaps the most important lesson is about the power of strategic honesty. For months, I had allowed Natasha to maintain her misconceptions about our family financial dynamics, because confronting those misconceptions seemed unnecessarily disruptive. What I learned is that allowing someone to operate on false assumptions isn't protecting them. It's protecting yourself from the discomfort of difficult conversations, while setting up even more painful reckonings in the future. If you're watching this and you recognize yourself in any part of this story, whether you're the person making assumptions about others, the person allowing false assumptions to persist, or the person struggling with whether to reveal truths that might disrupt comfortable illusions, I want you to know that authentic relationships require authentic information. You cannot build genuine connections with people who fundamentally misunderstand your circumstances, your values, or your capabilities. You cannot make good decisions based on false information about the people in your life. And you cannot solve relationship problems by avoiding the conversations that would reveal where the real problems exist. The most liberating discovery I made through this entire experience is that people who truly care about you will adjust their expectations and assumptions when presented with accurate information. The people who become angry or resentful when they discover they were wrong about your circumstances are usually people who were more invested in the story they'd created about you than in understanding who you actually are. Today, I encourage you to examine the assumptions you're making about the people in your life, particularly regarding their financial circumstances, their capabilities, and their obligations to you. Ask yourself whether those assumptions are based on direct conversations and verified information, or whether they're based on cultural expectations, visual cues, and wishful thinking. More importantly, consider whether there are truths about your own circumstances that you've been hiding to avoid disrupting other people's comfort or expectations. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in other people's illusions about who you are and what you owe them. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear about your own experiences with family financial dynamics, assumptions that turned out to be wrong, or moments when you had to choose between keeping the peace and living authentically. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the complex intersections between money, family, and the courage to live according to your own values rather than other people's expectations. Remember, your financial circumstances, your family obligations, and your social responsibilities are yours to define. Don't let other people's assumptions become your limitations, and don't let their comfort zones become your prison. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply tell the truth, especially when that truth challenges everything people thought they knew about who holds the real power in your relationships. The truth, as I learned that night at the Grandview Country Club, has a way of setting everyone free, even when it first destroys the comfortable illusions that people had built their lives around. But there's one final twist to this story that I haven't shared yet, something that happened just 3 weeks ago that made me realize the ripple effects of that engagement party confrontation were far from over. I was sitting in my office, reviewing investment portfolios for a new client, when my assistant buzzed me with an urgent call. "There's a woman online, too, who says she needs to speak with you about Natasha Pemberton. She sounds..." Well, she sounds desperate. The voice on the other end of the phone was shaky, nervous, but determined. Ms. Moreau, my name is Rebecca Chen, and I think you might have saved my life without even knowing it. Rebecca went on to explain that she'd been dating someone for the past 8 months, a man who'd presented himself as recently divorced, financially successful, and looking for a serious relationship. Everything had been perfect until she'd started noticing familiar patterns: pressure to upgrade her lifestyle, suggestions that she deserved better than her modest apartment, encouragement to join exclusive clubs and social organizations that were investments in their future together. The thing is, Rebecca continued, her voice gaining strength, I was at that engagement party. I work for Morrison and Associates as a paralegal, and Mr. Morrison had invited several of us to attend. I watched everything that happened that night, and something about the financial manipulation you described kept nagging at me. She'd started doing her own investigation into her boyfriend's background using techniques she'd learned from watching legal research procedures at the law firm. What she'd discovered had chilled her to the bone: a pattern of relationships with financially successful women, each lasting approximately 18 months, each ending when the woman discovered substantial debt or financial irregularities, each followed by the man disappearing and reinventing himself in a new city. But here's the part that's going to shock you, Rebecca said, and I could hear her taking a deep breath. The man I've been dating isn't just using similar tactics to what you described about Natasha. He is connected to Natasha. They're working together. According to Rebecca's investigation, Natasha and this man, who called himself David Sterling, but had used at least 3 other names in different cities, had developed what amounted to a sophisticated financial predation scheme. They would identify successful professionals in new cities, with Natasha targeting men and David targeting women, using remarkably similar psychological manipulation techniques to create financial dependency and extract resources before moving on to new victims. They had a whole system, Rebecca explained. Fake references, fabricated business credentials, even coordinated social media profiles that made them both appear more successful and established than they actually were. And the scariest part is how good they were at identifying people who were successful but modest about their wealth. People exactly like you described yourself being. The investigation had revealed that they'd been operating this scheme across multiple states for at least 5 years, leaving behind a trail of financially and emotionally devastated victims who had been too embarrassed or confused to report what had happened to them. Most of the victims had assumed they'd simply made poor relationship choices rather than realizing they'd been targeted by professional manipulators. What made me call you, Rebecca continued, is that I realized your engagement party confrontation didn't just expose what was happening to your brother. It accidentally broke up a criminal enterprise, because Natasha had to flee Millbrook before they could complete their plan here. She'd already contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and provided them with evidence of interstate fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy charges that could result in serious federal prosecutions. Several other victims from different states had been contacted and were cooperating with the investigation. But there's something else, Rebecca said, and I could hear the smile in her voice now. When I realized what was happening, I decided to turn the tables on David the same way you turned them on Natasha. I've been documenting everything, recording conversations and building a case. And tomorrow night, I'm planning to confront him at the charity gala where he was planning to introduce me to his quote-quote business partners, who I now know are probably his next targets. I found myself genuinely impressed by Rebecca's strategic thinking and courage. That sounds incredibly dangerous. Are you sure you want to handle this alone? Actually, she said, I was hoping you might consider being there, not to participate directly, but maybe to observe and provide support. You've already proven that public confrontations can be incredibly effective at exposing this kind of manipulation, and I have a feeling that seeing you there might rattle David enough to make him reveal even more than he intended. 2 days later, I found myself standing in the ballroom of the Millennium Hotel, watching Rebecca Chen execute one of the most brilliant psychological takedowns I'd ever witnessed. She'd invited not just David's potential targets, but also representatives from the FBI, journalists from the local business newspaper, and several attorneys who specialized in financial fraud cases. The confrontation was swift, devastating, and absolutely conclusive. Within 30 minutes, David Sterling had been arrested, his fake identity exposed, and his connection to Natasha confirmed through phone records and financial documents that Rebecca had meticulously gathered. The FBI agents revealed that this was part of a larger investigation into organized relationship fraud that had affected dozens of victims across multiple states. But the most satisfying moment came when Rebecca looked directly at David as he was being led away in handcuffs and said, "You chose the wrong woman to underestimate." Some of us learn from other people's examples. 3 weeks later, both Natasha and David were facing federal charges for conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering. The case had attracted national attention as an example of how sophisticated financial predators could operate within professional social circles, and how important it was for people to verify the backgrounds and claims of romantic partners who pushed for rapid financial integration. The ripple effects continue to spread. Rebecca has become something of a celebrity in legal circles for her investigative work, and she's been invited to speak at conferences about identifying and reporting financial predation in professional settings. Several other victims have come forward with their own stories, creating a support network for people who've experienced similar manipulation. More importantly, the case has sparked conversations about financial literacy, relationship boundaries, and the importance of trusting your instincts when something feels wrong, even when the person making you uncomfortable seems successful, charming, and socially connected. As for me, this experience reinforced something I'd learned that night at the engagement party, but hadn't fully appreciated until now. Sometimes standing up to one manipulator doesn't just protect yourself and your immediate family. Sometimes it exposes a much larger pattern of harm and gives other people the courage and framework they need to protect themselves and seek justice. The truth really does have a way of setting everyone free, often in ways you never expected, and for people you never knew were watching. If you've made it this far in the story, thank you for taking this journey with me. And remember, if something feels wrong in your relationships, trust that instinct. You might be the person who has the power to break a cycle of harm that extends far beyond your own experience. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to be silent about what you've witnessed or experienced. You never know who might be watching, learning, and gathering the courage to speak their own truth, because you spoke yours first. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.